Right. So the COMP, as I mentioned, has been the incubator for NeuroLibre, which has blossomed into this really incredible, alternative publication platform that we're going to hear about a lot about today. But the COMP is much more, it has many other components to that. And it's a huge amount of work that's been done by a huge number of different people who've really contributed some really amazing tools and resources, insights and expertise to build this complete platform. So I just want to acknowledge people before I get into all this stuff, because my role is really quite small. So I realize I'm talking to a lot of computational neuroscientists today, but as someone who is a wet lab person and does a lot of work interacting with patient communities, I kind of wanted to start off today by bringing us back to why are we doing this? Why do we need to think about alternative paradigms of academic research, particularly in neuroscience? And one of the key reasons in my mind is that our understanding of the brain, both in health and disease, is absolutely critical for addressing this really quite extreme burden that exists in our global society caused by neurological disorders. And so there was this publication that came out earlier this year in The Lancet, where basically 1 in 3 people in the world are impacted by neurological conditions. And they are the leading cause of illness and disability in the world. And the World Health Organization has put out many statements saying that this is only going to be exacerbated as we move into an aging population. So are we doing a good job as neuroscientists? Are we achieving what we're addressing this problem? And the way, as someone like myself who works in early phase drug discovery would like to think about how well neuroscience is doing on tackling this problem, is to try and think about, just look back and see what's happening in clinical trials. And I can tell you that the landscape in clinical trials for neuroscience is incredibly bleak. We have failures, retractions of drugs, and things are really not very good. And we have trying to understand what's going on. And what really is at the root of a lot of this is that our understanding of brain function, structure, and health, and how this is impacted by disease remains very poor. And there's a lot that we really need to do to address this, to ultimately deliver on, what really matters within the broader society, which is drugs for people and a better understanding of our, human biology. And so to achieve this, we need to think about, well, how can we move away from traditional academic structures, and how can we address this? And we really need a paradigm shift in the way that we do neuroscience to try and address these particular challenges. And that is a key part of what motivates the COMP. We've all been there where we sat and pulled our hair out over all of these issues that we'll see in, not only neuroscience, but other aspects of academic research, where we find that data is not as available as people maybe say it is. It's poorly annotated. We don't know the provenance. Particular research tools, when you rerun them in your own environment, don't work in the way that they're supposed to do according to their publications that detail them. And the CMP really believes that open science practices and trying to address some of these questions with open science workflows can really help move things forward and move the dial for pushing neuroscience in the direction that we want. And so the COMP, the Canadian Open Neuroscience Platform, is a pan-Canadian initiative. And our #1 goal is to accelerate discovery in brain research. As this means not only providing a way to share and access data sets, but also creating really large-scale databases that just would not be possible if they were done within a single institution. Another aspect is the way that we analyze the data and allowing, different pipelines and different combinations of pipelines to be used openly in a way that is reproducible. But beyond, as Patrick mentioned earlier, open science isn't just about data. It's not just about the way we do analysis and publications. It's this broader holistic approach as well, where we need to think carefully about how we share that data and train the next generation of neuroscientists, many of whom are in this room, to become, exemplary open science computational neuroscience researchers. And so we see the COMP as an end-to-end kind of support system and platform for neuroscience research. So starting with data and how that's acquired, processed, analyzed, and then shared within the research community. And there are many tenets of the platform that address different aspects of this research workflow. And so we have a portal which contains data, pipelines, that can be, shared by researchers or accessed by researchers and also executed all through this portal, as well as NeuroLibre, which you're going to hear a lot about today. But going back to this more holistic approach to open neuroscience, key aspects for that are the ethics and data governance. So this is like, how do we obtain data? How do we curate data? And how do we think about how we use that data in a reasonable and responsible way, as well as the resources and training that are required to do all different aspects of this workflow. So I'll start with NeuroLibre, and this is like one of the first things that I ever will connect with Nicola, is where he was always telling me about how wanting to go beyond the PDF. And I've never met anyone who so passionately despises PDFs, which was very confusing to me as a wet lab bench scientist who, a PDF was always, our prize at the end of everything when we get our data published. And it's really interesting to think about this as like actually one of the issues. And he's been, been developing NeuroLibre to try and tackle this and think about how are there alternative ways that we can share research outputs, and it's so interesting. And I just want to go back to, this is like the first time that I met Pierre-Lune and Nicola at this meeting in Toronto, and just want to pull this up, it's this lovely photo. And yeah, and it's from there, but this was 6 years ago when NeuroLibre was just this idea of like what they wanted to do, and it's now become this really incredible reproducible preprint server, which goes from submission of publicly available code through technical review, publication and hosting to create something that is a NeuroLibre preprint. And the CONP is incredibly proud of all the work that they've done on this. I want to highlight some of the other things the CONP has been working on, and many of these folks are in the room. So I mentioned earlier the portal, which is this really interesting decentralized database where you can share and upload your data and tools. You can like run pipelines. You can search, all these disparate databases to find data sets that you can pull together to do really interesting and unique analyses. And we think this is like a really unique and interesting platform, and a key tenet of like a, kind of a nice flagship project of the CONP. So I highly encourage you to check that out. As I mentioned, the other aspects of open science are things like thinking about how we look after our data, and how, a lot of this data, it comes from people, it comes from patient populations, and it's important that we consider the ethics behind that, and then how we govern how that data is accessed and shared with people. One of the lasting statements in open science community is, as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And there's lots of interesting bioethics considerations that we need to make of that. And something that I think is really interesting is, this is something that we don't always necessarily think about ourselves. Like, I'm not thinking about it a lot when I'm doing pipetting all my, samples in the lab. And I'm sure a lot of folks aren't thinking about it here when they're, running all their different simulations, etc. But I really like the way that the Ethics and Governance Committee kind of focused on these goals of like promoting trust within the communities of stakeholders within the neuroscience like landscape, whilst also working to protect people and give them autonomy in the way that their data is shared, and allowing them to be decision makers in how data they generate or contributed to generating is shared as well. And something that I think is also really interesting that we forget about in open science is that actually open science is clearly referenced in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, in the way that everyone has a right to benefit from scientific advancement. And this is a real driving force within our ethics and government community of how they do this. And so the outputs from this have been these really fantastic and highly useful policies and guides for how to share data, how to, ethically publish data that comes from these kind of, complicated backgrounds and communities. Thinking about privacy policies and other bits and pieces that we need to have in place. And so particularly for trainees and folks who are new in this field, I highly encourage you to check out all of these really awesome tools that they built. And so I also want to highlight the resources and training. So, we can't expect open science practices to happen in a vacuum. It's something that we need to instill in trainees from the beginning when they're starting out their careers in neuroscience. And so the CONP has awarded over 55 scholar awards to both graduate students and postdocs. And here I'm highlighting some probably quite familiar faces to some of you as two of our very esteemed scholars who received such awards. But in addition to providing these awards, the CONP also was really instrumental in creating some really awesome resources, which are accessible to anyone through the INCF. And you'll find all these really nice collections of tools and materials, which are all part of our Open Neuroscience Starter Kit, which was a huge amount of work that Patrick in particular put into creating all of this. So we have all this stuff, we've made all these tools, we've done all these things, but how do we get people to understand and use all these things? And, you know, talking to everyone here, you're already in it, like you're already part of the open neuroscience community, but we need to move beyond that. And so something that I worked on a lot with part of this project was thinking about communication and outreach and how do we actually move beyond our silos? Because a common issue with many open science practices is that we're already in the club, but we're a small part of the overall research community. And we need broader adoption of all of these different assets and practices in order to make a real change in the world and like how we're doing neuroscience. And I think this is something that will be an issue for almost anyone who's working in this space, for NeuroLibre, for CONP, for some of the open publishers and other folks who are here today. Like, how do we make this more broadly adopted? And so it's going to be an interesting discussion on that today as well. All right, so if you want to learn more about the CONP, we have our paper, which was published last year, which you can find in PLOS Computational Biology. And with that, I'd like to thank the CONP sponsors, and I'd like to thank you for listening.